It's been a while since I have used a vending machine, but they have gotten a lot more high-tech than when I was in high school. You no longer have to have coins or a really crisp dollar bill. You can put in your credit card. You can get iPhone accessories. Have you seen those vending machines at the airports where you can get all kinds of headphones and things? I saw a vending machine in Dallas where you could get gourmet cupcakes. I've seen vending machines where you can get a latte or a cappuccino to order, healthy wraps and sandwiches, right? It's not all Doritos, Funyuns, Snickers, and Skittles anymore. A lot has changed about the vending machine, but one thing still hasn't changed. They are still all about convenience. You see the options before you, you put in your form of payment, you make your selection, and voila, right? Without having to talk to another human being at all, you get what you want and you go on your way. Bada bing, bada boom, instant gratification. This is really how we like our world to operate these days, isn't it? We like to get what we want and be on our way. And you know, our cell phones have really become our personal vending machines these days. They are all about convenience. You may or may not have noticed that I controlled the lighting this morning for the video from my cell phone. Very convenient. If I'm hungry, I can just open up Grubhub and pretty much have any restaurant delivered here to Calvary in a matter of minutes. If I need a ride, I can open up Lyft or Uber and there'll be a car waiting for me. I can order my groceries and just swing by and have somebody bring them out to the car for me. And honestly, anything that I could think in my wildest dreams that I need, I think Amazon probably has it, and they can get it to me in one day, if not one day, maybe two. Convenience, convenience, convenience. This is our world. And it's no wonder then that we want our faith to be convenient too. We want Scripture to make plain sense without a lot of interpretive effort on our part. We want worship over in 59 minutes. We want to volunteer and serve in a nice and tidy 2 to 3 hour block of time that won't eat into our whole day or our whole weekend. We want our prayers to be answered quickly and with exactly what we asked for. The long and short of it is, I think often we really want to keep our lives the way they are and just kind of work in Jesus and religion as we see fit. Most of us want to maintain control. We want faith on our terms. We want to be able to get the feel-good high of religion without going through all of those lows that require suffering and endurance and patience and questioning and doubt. We like the idea of serving others and putting God first, but really the reality of our lives is that we put ourselves and our families first, right? That's what's important to us. And a lot of times we keep God kind of neat and tidy in a box, right? Here's God in my morning prayer time, or God in my Tuesday Bible study, or God here at Calvary on Sunday mornings. We struggle to understand that the whole of our lives is wrapped up in God, rather than God being like a candy bar that we unwrap to get a bite of nourishment or sustenance on our way. Katie Ziegler says, often we treat Jesus as if he's our personal vending machine. Someone who is there to answer our prayers as we see fit, as if we are the boss, like we know what we really need in life. If only he'd respond to our demands. And then when he doesn't deliver, we get angry or bitter. We wonder about his goodness. We rail at him and blame him that our lives are not how we pictured them to be, kind of like how we get when that bag of potato chips is stuck in the vending machine and no amount of shaking or banging will let it go. But, she says, Jesus is not our vending machine. We know this, right? But listen to your prayers sometimes. They might kind of start sounding like selections on a vending machine. Not intentionally, but just because this is the way our brains work, this is the way our world operates, this is the air we breathe. Sometimes I think we forget that Jesus has his own mission and ministry that is so much bigger than our personal needs and desires. Not that they don't matter, but that there is a bigger picture into which they fit into the whole. And Mark has been trying to drive this home for us throughout his gospel. And today, he grasps us with this truth again. The way of Jesus is usually not the way we would first think to do things. And I think that's one reason why when Jesus came to earth to walk and talk and be among us, that his primary vocation with us was as our teacher. We have to be taught to see ourselves and the world through the eyes of God. And we have to practice it again and again. And the truth is, we all have the capabilities within ourselves to see with that vision of compassion, those eyes of God, but they're really clouded over a lot of times with the spectacles of convenience that we put over our eyes, and often those are rose-colored glasses. Now, twice in today's passage, Jesus asks, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" The first time he asked this to James and John, and their answer reveals that they don't really know what they're asking for. They want to be near Jesus forever without realizing the suffering and the sacrifice and service it takes to truly experience that nearness. And Jesus actually grants them part of their requests. He says, "Can you drink the cup that I drink?" And they say yes. And so Jesus says, "Okay, you are going to drink the cup I drink. You are going to walk the way I walk. But in terms of sitting by me in glory, that is not for me to decide." Which should tell us a whole lot about what Jesus can grant us, which is his presence, right? And what he can't grant us, which is any guarantees about where this journey will lead. Now, the second time Jesus asks this question is to Bartimaeus, a blind man who wants healing. And Bartimaeus asks for sight, and immediately it is granted. Two different requests, two different responses, which means we're kind of asking ourselves, what is it that we want from Jesus? In the vending machine of possibilities, what selection are we making? Do we want a miracle worker who's going to fix us and our world? Cure coronavirus like that? Do we want someone to be our friend and comfort us, to tell us what we want to hear? Do we want someone who will grant us privilege and power on either side of him, right? Or, I don't know, maybe elect to the presidency the candidate of our choice? Do we want someone who will teach us how to be good, how to get those gold stars in our crown for God? Do we want someone who will make our life easier, who will suffer for us instead of with us? What do we really want from Jesus? And is what we actually want something that Jesus can give? That's the question of the day in today's passage. And Mark does not want us to miss the mark on this. And so he gives us this nice middle section in his gospel that actually begins right after the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 8. And it runs through the end of today's passage in chapter 10. And this middle section, these 3 chapters, are kind of like a hinge between Jesus' prior ministry, where he's teaching and performing miracles and calling disciples and kind of rising to fame, if you will, and the last week of his life, which is about suffering and death and persecution and, yes, resurrection. These 3 chapters in the middle of Mark, between the bulk of Jesus' ministry and the tail end of his ministry, are potent. And they follow a 3-fold pattern. The pattern is this: Jesus teaches his disciples about his upcoming suffering, death, and resurrection. The disciples respond in some way to this teaching that reveals they don't really understand what he's saying. So then Jesus responds to the disciples again in some form of a lesson that says, if you want to be my disciples, you have to take up your cross and follow me. If you want to be first, you have to be last. Whoever wants to be the greatest must be the servant of all. Suffering, suffering, suffering. Humility, humility, humility. Serving, serving, serving. I keep looking for convenience. It's not in my translation. And you see, this whole 3-chapter section in Mark's gospel is bookended with 2 really important stories, 2 healings of 2 blind men. And it's a not so subtle indication to us that we need to be paying attention perhaps to what we are not seeing in the text and what we're not understanding. It's certainly a clue for us as to how Jesus is viewing the disciples at this point, right? He knows they are blind. Now, to jump back to that first blind healing story in Mark 8, it's an unnamed man in Bethsaida. And it's the only healing that Jesus does that really doesn't take full effect at first. Jesus heals him and then says, oh, okay, now can you see, right? And the man says, well, I can kind of see people, but they look more like tree trunks that are walking. And Jesus is like, okay. So, he flips the optometry lens and does it one more time and says, okay, now can you see? And the man says, yes, now I can see. Vision intact. Now, this is a foreshadowing of this 3-fold pattern that is to follow, right? Of the disciples not exactly seeing at first the full understanding of what they need to see, what Jesus is trying to tell them and us about his suffering and his death and his resurrection. And so Jesus keeps clarifying further and again and again and again. And this is a pattern that follows us throughout Mark. It's a pattern that follows us in our own lives too, right? This pattern of thinking we understand one day, and then something happens in our life, and wait a second. The world is not how I thought it was. Faith is not how I thought it was. We see, as the Apostle Paul says, but not fully yet. Like the disciples, we struggle for understanding, to see Jesus as he is, not as we want to remake him, right, for our own purposes. And we have these flashes of insight that come, but then we also fall back into these patterns of kind of perpetual self-interest, right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. This is what we're seeing in today's text. We have this 3rd teaching of Jesus about his passion. That is his suffering, death, and resurrection. And it is the most detailed yet, right? Make no mistake, this is not going to be pretty. And following all these details about suffering and death, James and John run up to Jesus and say, Jesus, we want you to do whatever we ask you to do. Bold, right? Okay, Jesus says, what is it that you want me to do for you? And they essentially ask Jesus if they can have places of honor and glory with him forever, if they can sit on his right and left. This request, mind you, is coming right after a multitude of teachings about how the first shall be last, and the one who was greatest must be the servant of all. I mean, come on, James and John, right? Even if that's what you're thinking in here, haven't you learned to not speak that out loud, right? Keep that little desire to yourself. Haven't you been hearing what Jesus has been saying? Oh, it's frustrating. But it's us, right? And this is such an important point for Jesus in Mark's gospel, right? What will it take for James and John to get that Jesus is about serving and not about success? What Jesus is trying to teach his disciples is that his life, his mission, his passion is about giving. It's not about giving out accolades or awards or special places or positions. Jesus' ministry is about giving of himself. And that can look like a lot of things, but what it's about to look like in Mark's gospel is suffering and death. And no matter what we ask Jesus for in our lives, it must be asked in light of the fact that Jesus' life is defined by self-giving, sacrifice, and love. And that's all he can give us, right? He can't give us something that's not inherent to his very nature, right? He can't give us a position of power or glory because that's not what he is about. He can only give out that which flows from self-giving, from sacrifice, from love, from grace, and everything is seen in light of that. The focus is on Jesus and his identity. And then, once we understand that, we can learn who we are and what we're supposed to ask for. And that brings us to the final story of Bartimaeus. Because Jesus asks him the same question that he asked James and John. What do you want me to do for you? And what does he say? Well, let me see again. What a stark contrast, right? What do you want me to do for you? I want to sit at your right and left hand. Let me see again. It's important to note that that first blind man in Bethsaida is unnamed, right? So that he kind of becomes this representation of the disciples, of us, right? Ones who do not fully see. But Bartimaeus has a name, and his name actually means son of honor. Now, surely that can't be a coincidence that the one who is truly the son of honor isn't the one asking for a place of honor with Jesus, but rather simply asking to see. Honor, perhaps then, comes not from whom we are sitting beside and what status they can give us, but maybe rather from who we are able to see and what compassion we can give them. Bartimaeus is able to see something, despite his lack of physical sight, that the disciples cannot see. He is able to name Jesus as the Messiah, the anointed one. He greets him as such when he comes running up to him. He calls him teacher. And the minute his sight is restored, he follows Jesus. Did you catch that part? It's the very last verse. He follows Jesus on the way. The way is what the early Christian movement was called. This is not just a healing story. This is a discipleship calling story too. Jesus asks, what do you want me to do for you? I want a place of honor and status. I want to see. In the first story, the disciples really don't see anything beyond themselves. In the second story, Bartimaeus knows he can't see beyond himself, and he wants to. In the first story, Jesus gives James and John more insight than they really want about the road ahead and how hard it will be. And in the second story, Jesus gives Bartimaeus sight because of his insight, right? That he already knows who Jesus is, the nature of Jesus, and what Jesus has to give. How we approach Jesus can influence what we receive from Jesus, I think. It sets up our expectations. It helps us understand what faith and what Jesus is really all about, right? That he's not a vending machine at the whims of our desires, but that he wants to give us what is most life-giving, right? He is a giver of life and servant of all. And if we can understand who he is, then we'll know what to ask for. We'll ask for things that allow us to give more of ourselves, not things that will give more to ourselves. Wherever you are on your journey this Lent, perhaps make it your Sabbath practice this week to ask yourself the question, what do you tend to ask Jesus for? Do you ask him to alleviate your fears or heal your illnesses, to fix the world's problems, to rescue you or your family members? It's okay if you do that. He's well versed in that. He can take it. He hears it. He wants to know us. Perhaps, though, look to Bartimaeus and maybe ask Jesus to help you see something deeper. Ask Jesus to help you be patient in suffering, to be wise in the midst of indecision, to be brave in the midst of persecution, to be present with you in the midst of chaos. Mark makes it clear that to follow Jesus is to walk head first into conflict, confusion, suffering, uncertainty, illness, pain, marginalization, and death. And to follow Jesus is to walk through all of that and emerge on the other side with newness of life, with resurrection, with rebirth, with repurpose. And when you go through all that bad, hard stuff in life and you emerge resurrected with rebirth and renewal and a new sense of life, then you could care less if you're sitting on the right hand or left hand of Jesus, right? You're just grateful to be alive and be in Jesus' presence. It's a perspective shift. How can we see more fully? What do we want from Jesus? Maybe Bartimaeus gives us the best answer of all. Lord, help us to see. Help us to set aside our pride and ego and desires. Help us to see you and your self-giving nature, to see your love and your compassion, your servanthood. Help us to see our commonalities and our humanity and everyone's dignity. Help us to see our belovedness. And because, Lord knows, the minute we actually start seeing these things, some story is going to pop up on the news cycle that distracts us, or some life event is going to happen to us, and we're going to start getting caught up in our own stuff again. And so listen again to Bartimaeus, who says, Lord, help me to see again. Help me to see again. Help us to see again. And maybe, rather than just praying for things to go our way, maybe like Bartimaeus, we'll be ready and able to follow Jesus in his way, right? The way which leads through suffering and death, but ultimately leads us to resurrection and renewal and new life. May it be so for all of us. Amen.